Welcome everyone, and yes, welcome to our study of the Way of the Bodhisattva with the commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which presently is then published as the Bodhisattva Guide. It's very auspicious that we're beginning today. In addition to the French celebrating Bastille Day, which I guess could be taken as an auspicious event from the point of view of the overthrow of confusion, possibly. Then it's the what we in Tibetan call Chöko Duchen, which is the celebration of when the Buddha first taught. You might remember that when the Buddha attained enlightenment, he very modestly actually said, "I have found a truth that is profound, peaceful, free from conceptual constructs, luminous, and unfabricated. It is a Dharma which is like nectar. Yet, if I were to speak of it, no one would understand. So better I stay quietly in the forest." And that's where then Indra and Brahma, they requested the Buddha to teach. And they had to actually repeat their request 3 times. On the third request, then the Buddha he agreed to teach. But we generally say that it wasn't until, I think it's something like 49 days or 40 days anyway, that between Sagadao Duchen, the full moon of the 4th month, and then the today, then however many days that is, I think it's 40 some days, then the Buddha actually remained peacefully and just contemplated, sat quietly at the tree in Bodh Gaya, near the tree in Bodh Gaya. And then he proceeded to Varanasi. And at Varanasi then, some of his old yogi friends, he had been practicing, as you well know, and I think most of you know this story. But anyway, since it's today, then these friends, they had decided that the Buddha was seen as a lapsed yogi. He wasn't no longer an ascetic. And this is true, actually. The Buddha had given up the path of what we call the extreme of asceticism, or you could say self-denial, or this sort of extreme way of pursuing the project of truth. And that's where he had then accepted an offering from a young farmer woman, Sujata, and also so he had received from her some sort of a dish with curd and rice. So he had eaten, so he wasn't starving. And also he received an offering of some kusha grass from a farmer called Mangala, or Tashi in Tibetan, auspicious. And it was then that he sat under the tree and proceeded to achieve enlightenment. But his yogi friends that had been practicing yoga with him under these extreme circumstances, when they saw the Buddha, or rather they saw him, they met him at the deer park outside Varanasi at Sarnath. And then when they saw him there, they saw, oh, he's this lapsed practitioner. We're not gonna just pretend he's not there. And then when the Buddha approached, then they were deeply impressed with his presence, his radiance, and so forth. And that's where they couldn't help but bow down to him. And that's where he then taught for the first time. He taught the Four Noble Truths. And we say this is when he first turned the wheel of the Dharma. So, so that's today. And then we're going to begin a study of one of the great works of the Mahayana, namely the Way of the Bodhisattva. This also actually has a story that goes with it. This was spoken by really a siddha, an accomplished master who really articulated the pith instruction of the entire Mahayana path. And this is what we're looking at. This pith instruction, the way of the Bodhisattva, the Bodhicharya Avatara, presents the core of the Mahayana, the spirit of the Mahayana, which is essentially this greatness of mind. We sometimes rejoice in this world when we come across persons who have a great mind. We don't just rejoice necessarily in people who are terribly virtuous or goody two-shoes and sort of following the rules and all of that. We very much tend to rejoice when there's somebody who really has greatness, who has courage, who has love, who has warmth, who is not caught up in their own drama and is very much there for others, and also in a great way, also where they're not sort of keeping a tab on how good they are and so on. Just persons who have greatness. Well, from the Buddhist point of view, this is actually who we naturally are. This is not necessarily something that some people, they just have it and other people don't. In the Buddhist teaching, we don't really believe in that. There's not really any indication in the natural world or within our own experience that we just are one way, or that things are just one way. There's nothing really that just is one way. Everything is a continual fluid web of causes and conditions, is ever changing according to the causes and conditions are there. And we would say if we provide the right causes and conditions for this greatness of mind, if we begin to think out of the narrowness of our ordinary, unimaginative box, then we could begin to create the causes in our mind for greatness. We could aspire to greatness. We could reflect on the reasons for greatness. And this is exactly what Shantideva does in this work. Many of you are familiar with it, and this really is the, you could almost say the quintessential Mahayana pith instructions. Of course, we have different ways in which the Mahayana has been condensed into pith instructions on mind training, lojong, and we find these teachings so many places. And also we find these teachings in the pith instructions from our teachers. And these, of course, all are really valuable. But we regard the way of the Bodhisattva as this great classic. And we would say that the way of the Bodhisattva really presents the vision of this greatness of mind, which we call bodhicitta. It presents the way how we should actually recognize its value, how we should cultivate it, make it grow, how we should prevent it from becoming diminishing, and how we should take it to its ultimate objective. And this is also a discussion then of what we call the paramitas. The paramitas are then the actions which really create the causes for greatness. It's the practices of generosity, discipline, patience, energy, meditation, and wisdom. And so the way of the Bodhisattva really offers this path in terms of practical instructions. And the brilliance of Shantideva is really that he doesn't just sort of present something in a sort of bland, religious, boring, ordinary way. He actually makes some very valid arguments, and he very much is good at sort of turning egos, our self-centered logic, against itself. And essentially, he operates with language and imagery and this logic, which is very compelling. And hopefully, we should feel a bit sort of what do you say, annoyed or affected or provoked by Shantideva's logic. And of course, this is a work which is situated within a different paradigm, if you like, or different worldview than the one we have in the modern world. There's an understanding that we have handed down, or we have from the great sages, which extends far beyond the worldview that we've been brought up with within a limited, confined science that just really is concerned with what is tangible, material. This is a science that goes into understanding the very experience of reality. And so this is where we come from, the science of enlightenment, and hence, of course, this presents perspectives that we might not have thought about, or that we certainly weren't taught. And it presents really also this vision of the highest potential that is really innate to us. It's not as if we're trying to become something that we're not, but it's really coming from a place of recognition of what we truly are. The presenter of this, and the way of the Bodhisattva is this work in about 1,000 verses, or 1,000 slokas. And this, I personally keep this next to my bed and sort of just open it randomly in different places. And it's always something, you could say, it always seems to be something that's relevant and provocative. But it's a great work. And there are commentaries. For example, we have the Nectar speech of Manjushri from the great Paltrin, which is student Khenpo Kunzang Palden. What we're going to be looking at here is a short, summarical, really, commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was given in 1991 in Dordogne in France, where the various Buddhist teachers in this rather exceptional location in France. This was a big property that was donated by a very visionary, extraordinary Englishman who had bought up some land in France, and who then donated this to various Buddhist groups. So the lamas from these different groups, they all jointly requested His Holiness the Dalai Lama to come and teach. And among these was then Tukupema Wangyal, who has written the foreword. If you look in the Bodhisattva Guide, you have a foreword by Tukupema Wangyal, who particularly then highlights the extraordinary fortune of having a great teacher like the Dalai Lama, and speaks briefly about the Dalai Lama and the value of this teaching. And then also there's an introduction to the context. And this translation that we have is then made by His Holiness's teaching, and also the text that you can see in front of you here on the screen. These are translations by the Padmakara translation group. So we have a foreword from them also. I'm going to go straight into His Holiness's teaching itself. And I think the preface material you can read yourself. But I would like to say that the inspiration that we bring to this study and the motivation for this entire study is really the intention to get to the bottom of what drives suffering for everyone, everywhere, at all times. And it is this delusional condition of not properly understanding our own mind. And the paradox is there's actually no reason why we shouldn't be able to understand our own mind. We're with this mind all the time, and yet we just let it carry us away habitually with a mindless, unconscious, you could say, submission to our habitual way of seeing things and our habitual impulses. And this is actually, you could say, handing over the reins to confusion, and we needn't do that. And so understanding that this is what happens to us, this also happens to everyone everywhere. So we can't really expect the infinitude of creatures everywhere to be able to have that insight. But presently, we actually have the opportunity to get down to actually addressing this confusion and remedying this with actually taking the reins of this mind and getting to the bottom of what drives the confusion, which in turn drives our suffering. So we should really think in terms of the relevance of this teaching and also understand how this really is something that affects everyone everywhere, and we should engage in this teaching with the intention to apply it so that we can be there for others. This is, of course, then what is the intention of the Bodhisattva. So we would say we bring to this teaching the motivation of bodhicitta, the motivation really of bringing beings out of suffering and into a place of bliss, freedom, and perfect enlightenment. So, so we'll look at the text itself. I think many of you are familiar with the story of Shantideva. Now there's been so much, I've been giving so much introduction here. I think we just get on with the text, but we have Shantideva here. And one of the sort of lovely things about the teaching that he gave, this way of the Bodhisattva teaching, Shantideva being the author of this, was that when the Shantideva approached, or sort of when Shantideva was teaching the 9th chapter, so there's 10 chapters in this work. When he was teaching this, and this was just a spontaneous outpouring of profound instruction that just came spontaneously, he actually began to rise into the air. So you look at the Taka here, he's surrounded by the Buddha and Manjushri and Maitreya, and then what we call the 6 ornaments and the 2 supreme ones, as well as also the great masters Chandrakirti and Chandragami. And but anyway, Shantideva, who's then in the middle of the Taka, you can see he's on a throne, but then he's levitating. And this was during the 9th chapter, where he then began to rise into the air. We'd say when he arrived at sloka 34, I think it was, then he actually became immaterial, and the audience could just hear his voice. Anyway, the way of the Bodhisattva. So this is His Holiness the Dalai Lama speaking in Dordogne in 1991 to, I think there was something like 2,000 people present. That's what it says in the foreword. So, His Holiness says, I received the transmission of the Bodhicharya Avatara, the way of the Bodhisattva, from Tenzin Gyaltsen, the Kuno Rinpoche, who received it himself from a disciple of Sa Paltra Rinpoche. So Kuno Rinpoche was a great master who passed away in the 1980s and who lived from, okay, we can just get his dates, but he was an Indian who went to Tibet, and he was from Kinnaur in northern India, and he died in 1977, that's right, yeah. And he was immensely learned in Sanskrit, and he taught in Tibet Sanskrit to many masters, and he also received a lot of teachings. Finally, he was actually recognized as one of the really great teachers of Dzogchen. And His Holiness received this teaching on the Bodhicharya Avatara from Kuno Rinpoche, but His Holiness also received a lot of Dzogchen teaching from Kuno Rinpoche. And Kuno Rinpoche was really renowned. He was renowned for his great teachings on bodhicitta, and also renowned as a really great practitioner of Dzogchen. So Kuno Rinpoche in turn had received this from a disciple of Paltra Rinpoche. And Paltra Rinpoche also someone who probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, but just for Paltra Rinpoche lived in the 19th century, 1808 to 1887. And let's just read it. He was an outstanding teacher from Kham in eastern Tibet. He was recognized as an emanation of Shantideva and of Chenrezig of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of Compassion. He's perhaps best known for his book Kunzang Lama Shelong, translated as Words of My Perfect Teacher, translated by the Padmakara Translation Group, etc., etc. So we have actually from Paltra Rinpoche, we have one of his principal teachers' commentary, which is then the nectar speech of Manjushri. But we don't know whether this is the Lama from whom then Kuno Rinpoche received the teaching. Anyway, we could say there's a very short lineage then directly from Paltra Rinpoche, who really was renowned as a great teacher of the way of the Bodhisattva. So His Holiness says about Paltra Rinpoche, now regarded as one of the principal spiritual heirs of this teaching. It is said that when Paltra Rinpoche explained this text, auspicious signs would occur, such as the blossoming of yellow flowers, remarkable for the great number of their petals. His Holiness says, I feel very fortunate that I am in turn able to give a commentary on this great classic of Buddhist literature. Shantideva composed this text in the form of an inner dialogue. Let's see how we should understand that. Oh yeah, Shantideva. Shantideva was an 8th century Buddhist master at the monastic university of Nalanda in India. It was to the monks of Nalanda that he first taught the Bodhicharya avatar. He turned his own weapons upon himself, meaning his own sort of confused, you could say tyrannical, egoic logic. He turned that onto themselves, so to speak. So we would say he turned his own weapons upon himself, doing battle with his negative emotions. Again, battle here doesn't mean that he was in conflict, but he was just clear. He was exposing the fraud, the deception of the negative emotions, and basically taking away their power. So that's where we can see there was a showdown between wisdom and the confusion that perpetuates suffering universally. And he didn't just do it for himself. He did this really with understanding where suffering comes from universally, just like the Buddha had done. So His Holiness continues, therefore, when we teach or listen to this text, it's important that we do so in order to progress spiritually, rather than making it simply a subject of academic study. With this in mind, we begin each session of teaching by paying homage to the Buddha and reciting extracts from the sutras. So these are some extracts from the teaching. The first being from the Vinaya, and I think the other comes from Nagarjuna, and it reads: "Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion, or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop, or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning, or a cloud, so one should consider all compounded things." So the first sums up what we're doing with the Buddhist teaching, and the second here introduces the perspective of prajna, introducing how the phenomenal world and our subjective experience, it is vividly present, and yet, just like these images here, they're phenomena that appear yet have no tangible reality. So His Holiness continues, while reciting these words, we should reflect on impermanence and the lack of reality in phenomena, and conclude with a prayer of dedication. By this merit, may we attain omniscience and overcome our enemy, our harmful deeds, and may beings buffeted by the waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death be liberated from the ocean of samsara. So that's how we should open the teaching and how we should conclude. And then His Holiness says, next we should recite the Heart Sutra, the praise to Manjushri, and the offering of the mandala. So very often when we have teachings, we would actually begin with these recitations, and also we would begin actually offering a mandala to the teacher. And this is actually really significant. Again, coming back to the Buddha, what Sansa Rinpoche would refer to as a reluctant guru. The Buddha was never keen to be a teacher. And in general, we can see down through the history of the Buddhist teaching, the really great teachers have never been keen to be teachers. Nobody has ever been keen to have, you'd say, a following. Nobody has ever been keen to have power or administration, etc. And Buddhist teachers generally don't regard that as something that you would aspire to. It's rather that Buddhist teachers have taken on these roles reluctantly. So particularly in the Tibetan culture, there's very much a sense that you wouldn't want to have a monastery, you wouldn't want to have renown, you wouldn't want to be famous. And so, for example, somebody like Paltro Rinpoche was somebody who just wandered without any place to call his own. And for many years, he actually wouldn't even stay in houses. So this reluctance of the teacher to be a teacher is then prompts the situation that if we want teaching, the teacher is not going to come to us and sort of say, hey, this is what you need to know. And sort of like, you know, the missionary style is completely absent. The teacher is reluctant, and teacher doesn't think that there should, you know, that the teacher has anything to offer. And it's on the basis of this then that those who would want teaching, we request the teaching. And so we would actually make a symbolic offering of everything that's beautiful, which we call the mandala offering. And then we would supplicate the teacher, please turn the wheel of the Dharma. And that's, of course, what we're celebrating here today. And this also is reflected when we have a teaching within a proper Buddhist, you could say, context. It doesn't always play out in the modern world because we're quite new. But within the context of Buddhist culture, then what you always would do is make an offering to the teacher and then supplicate the teacher to please teach. So His Holiness then says, those of you who cannot recite these should simply think of the Buddha's kindness and reflect on the view of emptiness, which is the meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So these are then reflected in the words that we just saw before, in terms of the summary of the Buddha's teaching and also the introduction to the unity of appearance and emptiness, the verses from Nagarjuna, which then refers to the vision of reality that we are presented with in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And then His Holiness says, finally, we should renew our vows, taking refuge in generating bodhicitta 3 times. So that's where we say, in the jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. So we can do that here. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. So the first 2 lines is recognizing the value of the Buddha as someone who really was not interested in just, you could say, making life comfortable or just patching up the discomfort, but rather the Buddha wanted to get to the bottom of things. And that's where the Buddha's enlightenment is significant. The Buddha's enlightenment is to get to the very core of what drives suffering universally. And hence the Buddha's teaching is not just about something that's pleasing or something that, you know, the Buddha could have marketed as a cool device, but rather the Buddha's teaching is that which facilitates the elimination of confusion and the bringing about of our true nature, enlightenment. So this is why we take refuge. This is the Buddha can be trusted. The other guides, you know, they might be appealing in various ways, but what we really would want is the elimination of suffering universally. And then when it says by the merit of practicing generosity and like, this is actually in English, this sounds a bit funny. What really we're saying, it means through the merit of practicing the 6 paramitas. That's literally what it says. It says generosity and the like. But you see in English, that's so just vague actually. And the like just means, and the 5 others. It's very specific. It actually means the 6 paramitas. We can't really change the wording. And so translators, they would say, by the merit of practicing generosity and so on, or and the like, but it actually means the 6 paramitas. Now, the practice then of the paramita vehicle, which is what you could say synonymous with the Mahayana, then may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. So with that in place, then we then begin the study of the Bodhicharya Avatara. His Holiness says we will now begin our study of the Bodhicharya Avatara. And he says the master of these teachings, the Buddha, began by generating the wish for enlightenment. He then accumulated positive actions through many lifetimes, over a period of 3 great uncountable kalpas or eons. So the Buddha first generated the wish for enlightenment and then created the conditions for perfect enlightenment over many, many lifetimes. His Holiness continues, finally, in the age when the average human lifespan was 100 years, he entered this world and attained enlightenment on the Vajra throne at Bodh Gaya in India. So we say the Buddha then took birth into this world 2,500 years ago. And as we know in the story of the Buddha, then he renounced his role as a prince and proceeded to pursue the goal of enlightenment and attained enlightenment then in Bodh Gaya, India. His Holiness says, in the 25 centuries since he first turned the wheel of Dharma, of the vast and profound teachings, the Buddhist path has become one of the most important of the world's spiritual traditions. Let's see what we mean by that. The wheel of Dharma is the symbol of the Buddha's teaching. Turning the wheel of Dharma is synonymous with expounding the teacher. Further explanation is given later in this chapter. Okay, good. So that's where we are at today. And then we talk about the vast and profound teachings. These are actually associated with the two masters, Maitreya and Manjushri, and also Asanga and Nagarjuna. So that's generally where we talk about the two traditions of the Madhyamaka and the Yogacarya. But His Holiness actually makes this a bit more user-friendly and just talks about this in more general terms. And he says, I usually consider the teachings of the Buddha under two headings, activity and view. Activity means refraining from harming others. This is something that is universally helpful, something that all people appreciate, whether they are religious or not. So that's practice. So this is something that we very often see His Holiness do, simply giving good common advice, you know, the good heart, universal responsibility, and so on. And if you go to teachings with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you know, we sometimes joke that you know, the introductory evening will always be this rather feel-good, you could say, sort of very appealing, popular evening of delightful interaction with His Holiness and some very common sense promotion of human values. And this is something that everybody usually always loves. But then His Holiness very often follows up with a few days of teachings. There could be teachings on the Heart Sutra or the Middle Way or whatever it might be. That's not bad. That's a lot less sort of, you could say, a lot less feel good. It definitely rings true, but it follows very, you could say, very tight and rigorous logic in this present, you know, when His Holiness teaches this. So the first, of course, is then the teachings on activity, and then the second is then the view. And His Holiness says view refers to the principle of interdependence, happiness and suffering, and the beings who experience them. Happiness and suffering and the beings who experience them do not arise without cause, nor are they caused by some external creator. In fact, all things arise from causes corresponding to them. This idea is upheld by all schools of Buddhism. And so I usually say that our view, meaning the Buddhists, is that of interdependence. So this again comes back to what we saw earlier with the quote from the Prajnaparamita Sutras, that phenomena appear, yet they don't possess any inherent existence. Everything arises as an appearance that is essentially a flow of continual causes and conditions that that arise, where phenomena arise from causes corresponding to them. So an apple would arise from an apple seed, and we would say there's not an inherent seed, because the seed is changing on the basis of water and sunlight, becomes an apple. And so phenomena don't arise on the basis of just out of nowhere, and they also don't arise on the basis of some external creator. They arise on the basis of, they arise as appearances, basically as part of a web of interdependence. His Holiness says the view of interdependence makes for a great openness of mind. In general, instead of realizing that what we experience arises from a complicated network of causes, we tend to attribute happiness or sadness, for example, to single individual sources. But if this were so, as soon as we came into contact with what we consider to be good, we would be automatically happy, and conversely, in the case of bad things, invariably sad. The causes of joy and sorrow would be easy to identify and target. So we very often would say, I'm suffering because of this person or this circumstance. But then if we actually analyze, it's not really like that. It has a lot to do with how we are interpreting the situation, and it has so much to what we identify as the other or the circumstance is really not unified, unitary entity, but again, a set of conditions, possibly an individual, possibly a set of circumstances, but there are multiple things. And we make the mistake of just attributing one thing, labeling one thing as being an actual reality, which phenomena aren't. Our experience comes about due to countless causes and conditions. This is, of course, something that we're going to be looking at greater length, but it is actually really profound. And we should really, as you could say, the homework that we take with us from this in terms of insight is try to see how we actually mistake, how we actually naive in thinking that our happiness or sadness comes from just single individual source. We should try and see how it's actually not the case. It's made up of many different causes and conditions. This is important, and that also makes us, like His Holiness says, it provides a greater openness of mind. We become much more understanding for ourselves. We become more understanding for circumstances that we find ourselves in. We become more understanding with others, and it enables us to be much more skillful in dealing with our circumstances. So His Holiness continues, it would all be very simple, and there would be good reason for our anger and attachment, meaning that if just one thing was giving us happiness, let's say I'm going to be happy if I get, apple pie, a slice of apple pie, that would be so good. But we can see it's not just that, it has a lot to do with a number of causes and conditions. And if we were to get that apple pie, would that really give us happiness? Well, we know it wouldn't. Even if we get the perfect material object, the perfect lover, the perfect social status, etc. Does that really provide lasting happiness? We know it doesn't. So that's where we can see that all our attachment and all our worry, all our wishes and wants, and all our anger and resentment is actually not founded. It's the ways that we attribute solidity to the cause of our attachment and anger is not founded. So His Holiness continues, when on the other hand, we consider that everything we experience results from a complex interplay of causes and conditions, we find that there is no single thing to desire or resent, and it's more difficult for the afflictions of attachment or anger to arise. So that's where, when we begin to understand, you could say, complexity, and this is when we're more mature persons, then we begin to see, well, it's not that things are good and bad like that. It's more complex than that. When we have that, then it's difficult for the afflictions of attachment and anger to arise. So in this way, the view of interdependence makes our minds more relaxed and open. We become wiser. We become more engaged, actually, in the reality of the phenomena. We become more creative, more understanding, more resourceful, and more efficient when we have this view. So His Holiness continues, by training our minds and getting used to this view, we change our view of seeing things. And as a result, we gradually change our behavior and do less harm to the others. As it is said in the sutra, abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. So again, this quote that from the Vinaya that we saw earlier on. we would generally say the first two, they have to do with relative truth. This is understanding the causes and conditions that create happiness, namely abandoning causes for suffering, and also engaging in causes for happiness, which is a virtue. And then in terms of actually really connecting with the reality of things, where we could say we begin to eliminate our narrow-mindedness and begin to be more attuned to reality, what we could then call absolute truth. This is then where we talk about subduing our mind. This, of course, we do through training the mind and eliminating confusion. So this really sums up the Buddha's teaching. So His Holiness says we should avoid even the smallest negative actions, and we should perform even the most insignificant positive actions without underestimating their value. The reason for this is that the happiness we all want and the suffering we all try to avoid are produced precisely by our actions, or karma. So when we do something, it has an impact. We might think, oh, nobody notices, or what I do is insignificant, but everything is layered on our ground consciousness. We are conscious entities, and anything that we do, others might not see it, but we have what we would call the first witness, which is ourselves. Our consciousness knows, and it's also we are constructing ourselves through the actions that we do. So if we're generous, we're constructing a wealthy psychology. If we're being resentful, we're constructing a narrow-minded, alienated consciousness or character. So suffering doesn't have much to do with the external sources. It has so much to do with our own particular actions and the way that we engage with the world. And that's what we mean with karma. Our actions have an impact. Karma is not some mystery. It's just the fact that if you heat up water, it's going to boil at one point. So similar, just like the cause and effect that we see in the phenomenal world, well, our mind operates in the same way with cause and effect. We are the sum of our actions. So this applies as long as we are engaged within our phenomenal world and the conventional way that we see reality. We could say absolute reality, yes, that's beyond karma. But everything within the world that we experience presently is created on the basis of what we could call our karmic phenomena or karmic projections. So His Holiness continues, everything we experience is, as it were, programmed by our actions. And these in turn depend on our attitude. Whatever we do, say, or think in our youth is the cause of the happiness and suffering we experience in our old age. And it's also something that applies in every moment, where the positive actions are going to influence our attitudes. If we have a positive attitude, then this actually brings about a perception of the phenomenal world that's different from if we have a very negative attitude. He says, moreover, what we do in this life will determine the happiness and suffering of the next life. And the actions of this kalpa will result in the experience of future kalpas. This is what we mean by the law of karma, the law of cause and effect. And of course, within the Buddhist context, we don't see matter as primary, but we see consciousness as primary. So this particular aggregation that we refer to as our body and the experience that we have of this life is something that is manifested through consciousness. It's not the other way around, that sort of some unconscious, inanimate systems, biological, neurobiological systems, whatever they might be, that is what creates our being. It's the other way around. So we can say there's a difference here between the Buddhist perspective on this. There's a difference between the Buddha's enlightened understanding of the nature of reality, and of course the science that we're brought up with, which with all its excellent qualities is confined to simply just addressing material and predicting material phenomena. So this is where then the view of karma is very significant. Okay, I don't know if there's any questions at this point. Okay, not yet. I'll go a little bit further. There's not really any questions yet. There's a question here about refuge, and it's true. I've always welcomed people to ask questions about the Nundro. But maybe can you send me that question in an email, and let's just a little bit stay with the topic today. I'm happy to answer this question about the Nundro and about refuge, but send me the question in an email. That'd be great. Thanks. Someone's asking if I met Kunarinpoche. I didn't. I missed Kunarinpoche. I was actually in India at the time when Kunarinpoche was still alive, but unfortunately missed him. So His Holiness continues, on this basis, an action is called negative or evil if it results in suffering, which is something we wish to avoid. It is called positive or virtuous if it results in happiness, which is something we want. We consider an action positive or negative, not on its own account, but according to whether it leads to joy or sorrow. And this, by the way, is really important because, of course, we sometimes poo-poo this notion of virtue and vice and so on, and think of it as ungrounded in actual reality, and it's really just some archaic expressions for some absolute standards for how we're supposed to behave. And that's certainly not how we understand it in Buddhism. Actions, they're not in themselves don't constitute some absolute. Actions themselves don't lead to a particular result. It's the attitude behind, and also the circumstances and the conditions that follow a particular action that leads to a particular result. So that's where we don't know really what is good and bad, but what we can see is that we're suffering or we are happy, and it's about creating the conditions for that. And that's where we should understand the workings of the actions that we do. They really are contingent of the attitude and also the ways that we engage. So in that sense, actions in themselves are not something absolute. Of course, we very often in the Buddhist teaching, like you just saw, avoid negative actions, embrace what is wholesome and all of that. But we should also understand it's a bit more complex than that. And that's where there is an actual science about this, not just some prescription of this you should do and this you should not do, in the sense of uncritically, blindly. So His Holiness says this all depends on motivation. So the text says, subdue your mind. A mind that is not disciplined will experience suffering, but a mind that is under control will be happy and at peace. It's important to know all the methods for subduing the mind through the instructions of the vast and profound path. And this is what we're going to be looking at here in the way of the Bodhisattva. He says the antidote to hatred is meditation on love. To overcome attachment, we should meditate on the ugliness of what attracts us. The antidote to pride is meditation on the skandhas or aggregates. To counteract ignorance, we should concentrate on the movement of the breath and on interdependence. So we would say whatever destructive moods or destructive afflicted attitudes, or attitudes that bring about suffering that we might have, for example, hatred or attachment or arrogance or ignorance, etc. We can deal with all these in terms of specific antidotes. So this is not about us suppressing anything, but it's about us critically looking at what really is undermining our own happiness and applying clear measures to not be ruled by these ignorant and essentially destructive patterns. So His Holiness continues, the root of the mind's turmoil is in fact ignorance, on account of which we fail to understand the true nature of things. The mind is brought under control by purifying our mistaken notion of reality. This is the teaching of the Buddha. it is through training the mind that we can transform the way in which we act, speak, and think. So when we're looking at what drives suffering, we see it's not that the nature of reality is suffering. It's in the way that we fail to understand reality. So the teaching of the Buddha is not doing something particularly Buddhist, but it's really just us beginning to attune ourselves to reality, to actually look at reality. The Buddha is a teacher who really just asked us to look at reality, to be critical with regards to our own ignorance and our own destructive patterns, to be critical about our assumptions, and to actually extract ourselves from our rather parochial, narrow-minded belief in our own assumptions, and actually to look at reality, to have a wider view. This is also what we refer to as vipassana, seeing more. So but this has to be done on the basis of applying ourselves, applying the teaching to ourselves. And this, of course, means transforming our entire being in terms of how we engage with our life and our world, the way that we act, speak, and think. Okay, let's see if there's questions. Okay, then there's, can you share this image and its key on Dropbox? I didn't catch all the names. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, okay, I can definitely put the image in the Dropbox, yeah. I might just have the image up here sometimes, and then I'll sometimes go over who these characters are. I'm not even sure I could identify all of them. I know who they are, some of them, not all of them. Anyway, and then there's a question here. The Dalai Lama said in one of his documentaries that he meditates every day to know that he is not his mind. I always wondered what he meant by that, because mind training seems to imply that we are our mind, something to be controlled and transformed, but maybe this is not the case. Well, His Holiness just means that what we normally attribute to reality is what we say, me. And that's where we, for example, we have our own mind. We say, this is me. But actually, this me is actually imposing something onto, you could say, the display of reality, the display of our own mind, what we call the skandhas and so on. We actually are attributing an I to this. We are a set of circumstances. We are a person. We are living in a world and all of that. But once we begin to impute me, say I, then all of a sudden we're diminishing, you could say, our own reality, and we're diminishing also our interaction with the phenomenal world by positing other. So we have this me and other, which is really a delusional construct. So this is a little bit this is a sort of an interesting and provocative discussion that we'll be returning to here, particularly in the chapter on wisdom. But it is essentially where we impute a self where there is no self. Can you elaborate more on the skandhas, please? Okay. The 5 skandhas are what we call form, feeling, concept, impulse, and consciousness. And skandhas are, again, we're coming back to what we were just talking about in terms of self. The first skandha is where we begin to, out of ignorance, in our confusion, to posit self and other. That's where we solidify ourselves as person, and we solidify the perception of, you could say, the field or the display as other. And that's where we begin to have this sense of form. We solidify reality. And then on the basis of that, we have likes and dislikes in terms of what we're perceiving. On the basis of that, we begin to expound, you could say, narratives that identify ourselves and phenomena in terms of good and bad and so on. That's the third skandha, then concept. And then we have impulse. which is all the mental reactions to what happens to us. And then there's consciousness, in which we experience a united sense of I, and on the basis of this I, then the sense of the afflicted, aggravated sense of me, and then all our conscious experience. But all of that is tied up with this whole experience of the five skandhas. So we would say this reality that we perceive as being solid, this sense of I, when we look at it, is in fact made up of these aggregations. And that's what we then refer to as the five skandhas. Okay. I couldn't find this book online. May I know what the title again? Yeah, no. So presently, this book is being taught as the Bodhisattva Guide. So I think I'll just bring up the cover so you can see. So it looks like that. Yeah. So that's what you should be looking at, looking for, the Bodhisattva Guide. You can get it as Kindle. Are we only really experiencing our cultivated attitude through our present flux of emotional tone and reflecting that back and forth from the environment? I guess you could say so. Cultivated in the sense that for many lifetimes we've been laying down the seeds of particular patterns. These are always changing, of course, but they essentially all revolve around me. And that's where you can say we never really touch on reality, but we're always filtering through this filter of self. And on the basis of self, then we project other onto our, you could say, the display of our experience. Thanks for turning the wheel. You're welcome. If I have the Way of the Bodhisattva book, is that enough to follow this course? I also have Nectar of Manjushri Speech. Yeah. These are excellent works. They're, they will more or less, the translations that we have in the Way of the Bodhisattva, the translation by Makara, which looks like this. I'm doing promotion for these books. They will, the translation of the verses will be correspond. They should more or less correspond. Yeah. And of course, same with the Nectar of Manjushri Speech, which is a much more extensive commentary, but a wonderful commentary, so worth getting into. Okay, so somebody's sending, here is a link to the image with a description of the names surrounding. Oh, great. Well, thank you for that. Let me see if I can cut and paste that. Oh, well, hold on. Let me just do a screenshot of that. Then I can, then I shall be uploading that. Okay, so it's on. Okay, good. Okay, so we'll get the key up there for these great beings. The way of Bodhisattva, the way of a Bodhisattva, like the meaning of Shantideva's name, the peace being. Yeah, Shantideva, that's true, the peaceful God. Yeah. I think it's difficult at first to reconcile that there's no self when we use the terms self so freely in teaching that it does not exist. But then gradually, when we say self, we start seeing it as a simple and useful, necessary immutation to communicate the teaching of no self. Yeah, of course. Here we're just talking absolute truth. But the thing is, the less we fixate on self, the greater we are, so to speak. And that's the freer we are. But we're, of course, not talking about all of a sudden that we're free of this convention and this, it's a very practical handle. If you come into the men's room and the Dalai Lama is in one of the stalls and you knock on the door and says, "Who's there?" then Dalai Lama might say, "It's me." And of course, if there's a roll call among the sages, of course they will, say, "This is me," and so on. So of course, there is a very practical level of just acknowledging self. But there is what we call mere self. That's this sort of very simple relation to that's just me. But there's the place where the self then becomes the cause of toxicity, which is when we begin to make the great drama out of me, the center of the universe, and so on. So that's where there's a toxic condition that we call samsara, from which sentient beings universally suffer. And that's what the Buddha would like to awaken sentient beings from. But we naturally, of course, in our conventional everyday usage, we operate with a sense of, with the label self. It'd be very difficult not to. Yeah, the distinction mere self is very useful. Natsam in Tibetan. Yeah, natsam in Churke, the Dharma language. Okay, well, I think we're just up at the hour then, and maybe we'll leave it at that. I'll just put in a bookmark here. So we'll begin here next time. Thank you very much for joining in this teaching or study that we're doing together. So, may Bodhicitta, precious and sublime, rise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Just a little announcement. Because it's Chuko Duchen, or the celebration of the Buddha first turning the wheel, there's going to be we're going to be doing a practice here at 5 Peaks tonight at 6:30. I think you can join. We'll switch to Zoom on at 6:15, and then the program will start at 6:30. And basically, we'll just practice the Buddha sadhana together. I'll say a little bit about the particular day, and we'll chant a short sutra or a section from a sutra at the end. But basically, we'll do the Treasury of Blessings practice in a little bit extended way. So the program will probably run for an hour and a half or something like that. So we start at 6:30, and if you're on the mailing list, you would have received the link for that. And if you haven't, then I think it should be either on the siddharthasi.org.au website, or else shoot me a mail and I'll send you the Zoom link. Okay. So have a wonderful Chuko Duchen. Okay.